The pledge, please.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
We'll go ahead and take a roll call for tonight. Supervisor Elverman is excused. Steve.
Oh, sorry.
And Bill's not here. Oh, and Supervisor Franco is excused too. He did send me an email. So we have Supervisor Skolitsky is not here, and either is Supervisor Grady. Okay, we're going to go ahead and move on with our presentation for tonight. I'm very excited to present to you our ADA Mike Graveley, who's here to give a presentation on our heroin addiction. So if you could please join me in welcoming Mike Graveley.
Madam Chair, members of the Board of Supervisors, thank you so much for this opportunity to talk about the emergency that I think we're experiencing in this county at this time. I want to start by acknowledging Guida Brown, who's in the audience, who is the head of the Hope Council and who is a person who, as part of her varied job description, is a educator on addiction and on both alcohol and drug abuse in this community, and has been a mentor to me and has taken me along on a road trip where we literally have gone to community group and community group after community group in this community talking about this crisis, trying to educate the public on where we are and maybe a few of the things we can do next. And so she's here today again trying to be a part of that educational process. So why are we here, and why is somebody like me saying that there is an emergency or a crisis that we face? And I want to say as plainly as I can that I began in 1989 as a prosecutor, and the level and consequences of the use of heroin and opioids in this community have reached dimensions the likes of which I have never seen before in my career. And what I mean plainly by that is that I have never seen heroin more pure, which is always a sign that drugs are dangerous in your community. Heroin has never been cheaper in price than it is in Kenosha as we speak. And because of those two things together, these substances have never been more dangerous. I read in the paper today that we're not the only community that suffers from this damage and dilemma. The Milwaukee Journal today had 12 overdoses in Milwaukee County over Labor Day weekend. Almost all of them surely opioids and heroin. And so I want to talk for a little while about the dimensions of the crisis and then give you an idea of one additional thing that you, the board, should consider that we might do. So I always begin these talks by making sure that we're on the same page in terms of the dimensions of this crisis. And the first thing that is important for me to have you leave with is that the heroin crisis is in no way in isolation in this community. Opioids, meaning prescription painkillers, are exactly the same problem. They are completely intertwined in terms of the crisis and dangers we face. And so when I talk about opioids, I'm talking about heroin, which is from the natural plant, of course, the poppy, but I'm talking about all the chemically created opioids that have the same properties and the same dangers. So just quickly, we're talking about oxycodone, we're talking about Percocet, we're talking about Vicodin. We all remember Brett Favre's tearful press conference where he talked about his dependence on that drug. We're talking about fentanyl, which the rock star Prince, we just found out, died of an overdose of. And certainly we're talking about hydrocodone. And today I read again in the New York Times about a substance called carfentanil, which is yet another extremely powerful opioid, where Ohio over the past 2 weeks has had over 200 overdoses on what is a powerful animal tranquilizer. I don't think it has a single human use, but is now part of this opioid crisis across this country. So how did we get here? How did we get to a point where we have this shared crisis of opioids and heroin? I think we have to say that most of the opioids we're talking about have been in existence since the early 20th century. So these aren't new medical things that have shown up and began to be abused yesterday. But previously, the medical model in this country was that opioids that were prescribed had a very different use than in today's world. Doctors used to prescribe opioids to manage pain for very brief periods of time after surgeries or after serious accidents or in the end-of-life type situations. And now I want to tell you that I think the medical model has changed. In the 1980s, there were a series of organized research efforts. All the major medical journals had articles claiming that opioids, these powerful prescription drugs, could be used safely for much longer periods of time. And the model slowly but surely changed. U.S. doctors began to prescribe these powerful, addictive drugs for what was chronic, meaning more long-term, but certainly non-terminal pain. And so we changed as a country. We went from a place where when you went to a doctor's office, you expected to have pain. You understood that the body was giving you signals about the sickness and the illness you had. Instead, we became a culture where we expected doctors to let us leave those offices pain-free. And that has had real and true consequences in this country, certainly in the United States. So what's happened? Well, since the 1980s, as that model changed, from 1994 to 2006, the percentage of U.S. adults who had used a powerful prescription opioid in a given month, so again, 12-year period, 94 to 06, percentage of U.S. adults who had used a prescription opioid in a given month doubled from 3.4% to 7% of all U.S. adults were using a prescription opioid in that given month. We peaked as a country in our prescriptions in 2012 when U.S. doctors wrote 282 million prescriptions for opioids, which is a bottle of prescription opioid medicine for every U.S. adult in 2012. And in a 20-year period, again peaking in 2012, the United States per capita, every American consumes 6 times more opiates than we had just 20 years ago. 600% increase. And of course, with that sort of change, dire consequences happened. From 2000 to 2014, 165,000 Americans died from prescription opioid abuse. So here's the stark figures we face today. In the U.S., every day, 52 Americans die of prescription opioid overdoses. Okay, 52 a day. Every day, including today, 3,600 new Americans will start misusing opioids. So every day, another 3,600 of us begin to abuse these drugs. That's the current figure. And here's something that is, you can't be more stark than to say we are 4.6% of the world's population as a country, and we use 80% of the major opioids in our nation. So I told you we peaked in 2012. Doctors began to go to conferences, the media began to start a conversation where they said, this can't be right. Something's wrong here. And so since that peak, we've gone down 12%. Okay, now you still would have loved that stock, right? Up 600%, now you're down 12. So, you know, you still are in a situation where the crisis is grave. But with that slight decrease, that 12% decrease, what do you think is the problem that has come in its wake? Heroin. As we wean off prescription drugs, the heroin crisis increases. So why is that? Well, obviously, the same chemical properties in heroin and these opioids, okay? We're talking about the same place in the brain that it does its work. And so you get a similar high, okay? The part of the brain, the pleasure receptors, flood the brain with euphoria with either prescription opioids or heroin. You get the same high. But here's the tragic economics of heroin. Most of us grew up in an era, at least I did, where heroin was the expensive drug. Okay, now I don't speak from experience, I'm just telling you what I learned in drug education was heroin was the expensive drug. Here's the reality I've been told about by our undercover drug officers today. The stark, horrible economics of heroin use. To get the needed dosage to stay not sick because you're physically dependent on prescription drugs, to get high, you need about $50 worth of black market pills if your doctors cut you off. Okay? To get the same high, to achieve the same physical needs, on the black market for heroin, $10. 50 versus $10. That's the economics that we're combating in moments like today. So, to talk further about this problem, we need to understand something else. The DARE graduates in the room, we learned in drug education, okay, that heroin was that drug people got to after they had progressed through all of the rest of the gateway drugs. Okay, so, and we were able to list them off, right? You know, people would use marijuana first, and then they would abuse, cocaine, and then they would move their way up, and after years of drug abuse in which everybody could see the signs, suddenly the heroin addict would be the person with the needle in the back alley. We'd all be able to see who it was. That's the stereotype and the prior knowledge that many of us bring into this room. But the new heroin addicts of today are nothing like that. And this is an important fact for all of us to understand. 4 out of 5 new heroin addicts come straight from prescription pain pills. So we have an entire new generation of heroin addicts with these horrible consequences who are the athlete who hurt his knee and so took pain pills as his doctor prescribed and never left that physical dependence. Okay? Those are the new heroin addicts of our community and across this country. So that old idea of who and why people are addicted to heroin is no longer the true facts of the dimensions of the problem we see today. So in 2014, they did, the folks who try to compile this information said 467,000 heroin addicts in this country, a number that has tripled since 2007 nationally. And at that same time, heroin overdoses, the death by heroin overdose, have also exploded. In 2000, you measured the heroin overdoses in this country in the hundreds. In 2010, it was up to 3,300. And by 2014, it had tripled again to 10,000 overdose deaths annually. So, of course, a relevant question for you folks is what do we look like in Kenosha? And it was interesting to me that at a micro level, at a community level, none of our people who serve either the population of those addicted or those who are in the treatment community, no one's ready or willing to venture a guess on how many heroin addicts we have in this county. Because it's a chaotic population, it's a difficult population to quantify. But we have some numbers that are instructive. In 2015, our county's hospitals had 1,500 ER visits for issues involving overdose. I talked to an ER physician a few months ago who told me that he literally has revived some of the addicts he sees 5 or 6 times, bringing them back to life and then having them leave and be back because of the extreme and difficult dependence that they are suffering from. County programs that deal with IV drug abusers, so these are folks, heroin addicts who are taking intravenously by shot. There were 499 individual participants in those county programs. So we know that number to be a quantifiable people getting some programming in this county. But if that's how many we're giving programming to, how many do we give are not asking for those opportunities or do not have any programming, just again as an instructive figure? Okay. One other thing I haven't mentioned. Another way that heroin is so insidious and makes us vulnerable. I mentioned to you that heroin's never been more pure. What that means is you can snort heroin for longer periods of time before you have to be that person who injects the drug to get high. Okay? And think about how compelling that is. Because every heroin addict I've ever met says, well, I swore I would never, ever inject. Okay? So they begin their heroin experience by sniffing it, by inhaling, and get to the point where it physically overcomes them to the point where their resistance to the needle, of course, disappears. And that, again, is even more accentuated by how pure the substance is in our community now. So let's talk about local fatalities, because in the end, that's one of the places we must pause and consider. In 2013, 47 Kenoshans died of heroin or opiate overdoses. In 2014, 53 died. In 2015, 44 died. So over the last 3 years, 50 Kenoshans have died a year of these deadly substances. Let me go back to 2013 for a second, because we have some other instructive numbers. 47 died in 2013. Another 57 were saved by what I consider a miracle drug, Narcan. Okay? Now, there are people in this room who have direct experience with this substance. YouTube someday, if you're interested. It literally brings people back to life. The way you overdose on an opiate is you cease your breathing. It destroys your ability to breathe. And Narcan, either injected or now they have a nasal way that they administer it, will literally bring people back to life. So 57 people in 2013 are saved by Narcan. In any prior heroin epidemic, without Narcan, we would be losing 100 Kenoshans a year. Imagine what the outcry in this community would be about anything that killed 100 of us a year. What sort of public health emergency and outcry we would have in those circumstances. And another way I want to talk about that is to compare to traffic fatalities. In 2013, twice as many people overdosed on opioids as has died in traffic fatalities in this county. So I want you as public officials to think about the amount of time and training and instruction and resources and money and law enforcement that we spend to stop traffic fatalities. Think of how much of our culture and society is focused on that. And then consider a problem that kills twice as many of us. And ask yourselves, do we bring the same emphasis and resources to this crisis? And I haven't even brought up the other impact in the criminal justice system of heroin and opioid abuse. And that is, if you live and work in the criminal justice system every day, and I know that that supervisors here who have that experience will agree with this. Virtually every home burglary that occurs in this county is, at its genesis, someone dependent on heroin. Virtually every armed robbery of a small store, a small establishment in this community, has heroin abuse at its beginning. So this is a crisis that impacts every business, all of us as we walk and breathe and try to succeed in this community, and it, in fact, infects us in our very homes. All right, depressed yet with the idea and the consequences? Let me talk about a couple of things that we do well or that I think are the beginnings of solutions. One of those is the Kenosha County Drug Court, and I want to recognize the efforts of the really heroic people who do that work, because the Kenosha County Drug Court is a diversion court, but it has a very targeted population. It targets chronic, long-term drug abusers who have failed on probation, who've been jailed, in fact, many times prison before, and still have addictions they have not overcome. And so we're really targeting people who are one step short of going to prison in drug court. And with that population, okay, difficult as that is, we have a good, solid track record of success in trying to end addiction in that drug court. And then I want to recognize the current Vivitrol program. Okay, there's a pilot program in Kenosha now, and I believe direct credit to that goes to County Executive Jim Cruiser, who's here in the audience today. I think, again, wanting to hear and be educated and to be in the forefront of dealing with this crisis. And County Executive Cruiser partnered with Human Services and a treatment provider, professional services group, and they came up with what I consider a visionary pilot program, all right? And much credit to County Executive Cruiser for being at the forefront. And what that program does is it targets, in my opinion, the most difficult other addict population we have. That Vivitrol program targets people who are dual diagnosis. They are opiate addicts and they have a mental health diagnosis. So that is the most chaotic of the chaotic populations, okay? So this pilot program, Vivitrol, is a once-a-month injection. Vivitrol is what's called an opioid blocker. And what an opioid blocker does, and forgive me if you have some medical training, because I am, as you're going to soon see, a rank amateur at this kind of explanation. But what an opioid blocker does is it takes the receptor in the brain where opioids would usually go and settle, and then would cause, because the opioid settles at that receptor, would cause the flood of euphoria, the high. And Vivitrol, an opioid blocker, takes that space. All right, it occupies the seat. And because it blocks that spot, it literally takes away the craving. Once a month injection takes away the craving that the addict has for opiates, for heroin. I've spoken to more than a dozen folks on this drug. Okay, they get once a month injection. I'm told usually people go from about 100% craving to something under 10% in terms of how they rank their own percentage of how they crave. Now here's what else you should know about Vivitrol. It's administered, as I said, by injection. It's not itself a controlled substance. So it's not addictive itself. It has no black market value because it won't get you high. And if you take heroin with this in your system, heroin will not have an effect because the seed is already taken. Okay? Now you have to be clean. Your system has to be clean of these drugs for it to be effective. It doesn't stop people from other addiction issues. It doesn't stop people from abusing things that aren't opiates like cocaine and marijuana. So it certainly has its weaknesses. But in terms of combating opioids, it gives us one path to use modern addiction science to start to fight this plague. And I applaud the county executive for him starting this program and getting us some evidence-based solutions to begin this process of fighting this crisis. Okay. So you've heard me talk about the dimensions of what we face. now I want to propose that you consider a new program this year, or really an additional program. What we want to do in the district attorney's office is begin to talk about adding to that pilot program and bringing a new population, a new group into getting Vivitrol and fighting this problem of addiction. Okay, so there are three main things I want to talk about there. The first is who would be eligible for a new program that I'm asking you to consider. So I've mentioned the chronic population just one step from prison. I've mentioned the dual diagnosis, mental illness, addicted population. Who we're not dealing with, giving an opportunity to use a Vivitrol right now, are the brand new, first time in the system folks who are addicted to these opiates. So the program we're proposing is to take first time heroin possession cases, first time through. And when I said heroin possession, I want to make sure you hear me say it. I'm not talking about people who are arrested or dealing with heroin dealers. Those are people who will still go to prison in this community. I'm talking about people caught possessing heroin or possessing these opioids. By the way, that itself is a felony. Just possessing those is a felony, which of course has life-changing circumstances for people when they are arrested and charged and brought through the criminal justice system on those charges. So first-time offenders, we want to divert them and offer them an opportunity of treatment using Vivitrol, using science, to avoid criminal convictions. If they fail, what we've lost is just the few months that we took in the first place. You can always go back and charge them with that original possession crime. So they would have every opportunity to change their lives that first time. The second piece I want to tell you is because we're talking about adding to the current Vivitrol pilot program, we're suggesting something cost efficient because the infrastructure is already in place. We're not reinventing the wheel. I'm not here telling you, hey, let's start something brand new that we're not trying in any way. And we're using evidence-based practices because we're already talking about something that has a track record with people who have a track record administering it. And lastly, I want to talk about this new proposal that I hope you'll consider as a partnership. I want to first recognize District Attorney Bob Zaff, who's here today. When he ends his term this year, members of this board, he will be the longest serving district attorney in this county's history. And I'm going to tell you that he is the architect of the program that is being proposed. This is something that matters to him. He has said from the very beginning of the discussions about this proposal that this is something we have to do. We have to consider ways to help and treat those who are beginning stages of this horrible addiction. We have to stop people from becoming the burglars of our homes and the robbers of our businesses before it's too late. So that's the beginning of the partnership, but I refuse to stop there because the county executive, again Jim Cruiser, has indicated that he will place in his budget proposal this idea. So again, showing that long-range vision that we need to be able to confront this crisis. And his mentorship and guidance in terms of discussing the practicalities of how this could work have again been invaluable, and I just want to thank him personally for all of his efforts in this regard. And this program was designed with John Jansen from Human Services and his staff being complete partners as well as local treatment providers. And there are a number of people here in the audience today who are treatment providers, people who do the heroic work of battling addiction in this community every single day. And those individuals, and I see Tony Moore and some others here, are people who fight this battle every day. And I can't tell you, when this idea is explained to them, the excitement in their eyes, the people fighting this on the ground, the excitement in their eyes is something true to behold. It really makes me proud sometimes to be somebody who was a part of formulating an idea when I know people who are heroes in this community get that sort of reaction to this idea. So then the last partner I want to bring up is our law enforcement community. Okay, because I didn't come here having done no sort of ground building before we got here. Okay, so we went and asked the sheriff, and Sheriff Beth is a complete and profound supporter of this concept, and as is the police chief here in Kenosha, as well as the police chiefs in both Pleasant Prairie and Twin Lakes. I bring them up, those last two, because I want you to understand the magnitude of the problem of heroin and opiate addiction we have reaches every single part of this county and this community. And so the prior ideas that heroin wasn't something that was west of the eye, that is no longer something that anyone can intelligently say. And so these local police chiefs in Pleasant Prairie and in Twin Lakes agree this is another tool that we should use to fight this battle. Okay, so I'm going to make one last plea for you to consider this idea and proposal. When I thought about talking to you members of the board and the magnitude of what we're speaking of, I thought of those who are afflicted, those who are fighting in the throes of these addictions, as our lost souls in this community. And they are lost, members of the board, but they are the sons and daughters and the brothers and sisters, and they are the mothers and fathers of young children in this community. And they are lost in the throes of their addictions. And so because of that, some of the best parts of them are right now, this moment, broken. So what do we do? In public life, what do we do? Do we write them off? Are they discarded because parts of them are broken? I come here personally today telling you that in my 25 years as a prosecutor, I have been a part of sending more than 1,000 people in this community to prison. And because of that, I hope I speak with some credibility today to tell you that incarceration has to be part of our solution, but it can't be the only answer. It just can't be. There have to be more tools in the toolbox to fight this emergency. We have a public health and a criminal justice emergency in our hands. And in those moments of crisis, all of us are measured. And a legitimate question will be asked of all of us. What did we individually do to give people a chance to mend themselves? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. I'm going to open it up to questions now. Supervisor Gens?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I listened intently to what you just said, and there's two things that jumped out at me. The first is your ending plea was for this intervention first offender program. I think that's a great idea, but I don't know if it goes far enough. I mean, what we talked about here really wasn't reaching the children. The kids, 14, 15, 16 that are getting started with this. I mean, that might be a first offender, it might not. Right. But where is our community education and training, and what are we doing in that area? I'd like to hear for a minute on that.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you that when Guida and I have gone around to the different sort of civic groups, and we've talked to in a variety of different groups now, the level of understanding of the dimensions of this problem are very, very small. And it's not that it's not in the news, it's just that what we've talked about how all these things fit together, I don't think people understand. And you're right, I mean, those kind of ideas and the dimensions of this crisis should be in every school building. It should be a part of everything we do. And I think that the alarm is out, that people are starting to talk, that certainly conversations like this matter, but you're right, not nearly enough has been done in that area.
Yeah, I think that's a place we have to look to expand how we're battling this. Because if you're not starting with the foundation, I mean, the two programs that you talked about, they come in after the fact.
That's right.
And if, I mean, it's the same thing with mental illness. I have that same battle. If we're waiting to do the finishing stuff, we need to do more of the preventative stuff. So, I mean, I'd like to hear more of a plan on that eventually. The second thing is you brought up dual diagnosis and mental health, and I think that's something that, that's critical to our finances here as well as helping people. And I mean, the first year that I was on Human Services, we had 2 placements, which were almost $750,000 that we didn't plan on. So I think that's another thing that, I'm not as comfortable chasing the ball as I am being where the ball's going to begin with.
Well, excellent points. One of the reasons why I think that the pilot program, which dealt with those dual diagnoses, was so visionary is because the costs are so enormous on the back end, just what you identified. Yeah.
Anything else, Supervisor Kentz?
No, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Supervisor Rose, you have the floor.
Thank you, and Mike, compliment you on the presentation. When this comes before the Finance Committee, I certainly will support it. And I think the board will also, as it has supported both the drug court financially and approved, as this board has approved the Vivitrol program in our budget as well. So I think that we certainly have a track record of support for this type of thing.
Thank you.
Supervisor Bostrom, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I, too, compliment you on your presentation and certainly your leadership for taking on this task and bringing it forward. I certainly appreciate it. And thanks also to County Executive Cruiser for his leadership and vision as well. Piggybacking off of what Supervisor Gent said, I want to start by saying the stereotypes that you have dispelled, I think were really important to hear and need to be continually reiterated, because this isn't a young person problem. This isn't a poor person problem. This hits every age, male, female, educated, non-educated. It affects literally everybody in this community. In fact, I'd venture to say that there's people in this room that are affected by it as well.
Yeah.
I understand the drug court portion of what you do is for the end of the line, repeat offender. This is your last opportunity to get it right. And I applaud the first offender portion that we're going after now, but there's a big chunk in the middle. How does that get addressed? Is there a plan to address that?
So, obviously, we're talking baby steps, right? So,
Correct.
We're trying to find the population of folks who still have significant family support, who are individuals who maybe still offered an opportunity to stay out of the criminal justice system. We'll snatch that up with that opportunity. That other group are the folks that we're now aggressively dealing with in the criminal justice system. So they're being put on probation, they're being jailed, they're getting those kind of consequences. And, we can debate for a long time about whether that is defeating the addiction or not. I mean, it is the strategy we currently have available. If programs like this work, as we build a track record with something like Vivitrol, this is something that certainly, decision makers may want to consider expanding in other locations. But, from our perspective, this is the logical next start.
And certainly I agree with that, and I don't want to get into a long, deep-heated debate over this, but I would suspect that in that very large portion in the middle, there's many that fall into the criteria that have significant family support, that have had counseling.
Sure.
and
Sure.
other support areas that still fall off the track that might benefit from this program.
Absolutely.
I would look forward to, as we're going through this first baby step, to certainly keep that option open.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Bostrom. Supervisor Wambolt, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mike, thank you for being here. I've heard you speak a couple of times now, and I learn something new every time, so I appreciate that. But just to piggyback on what Supervisor Gens talked about as it relates to kids, have you presented to the school districts talking about maybe what they can do in their health classes to combat this problem?
Guida and I haven't. We've so far focused on sort of, the folks we thought were sort of opinion makers because we wanted to set that out. But one of the things we've talked about is how to provide this sort of educational piece to the schools. I'm not sure if we're the logical people, but certainly we're out there doing it every day.
Well, I know you're going to present at Indian Trail, aren't you?
Yeah, I am.
Soon?
Yeah.
Who is that going to be presented to?
Yeah, that's again an audience of some kids, but then also parents.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Exactly.
Thank you, Supervisor Bostrom. Supervisor Ron Frederick.
Yeah, I was interested in you said something about cocaine is readily available and cheap. Did you say that? Maybe I missed it.
No, I said, I expressed surprise that heroin is now cheaper than cocaine.
Well, I was saying is that, but I guess what I was asking is are there a lot more dealers out there now, and competition usually drives the price down, right?
It does.
So there must be a lot of dealers out there, right?
Well, there are a lot of dealers, and what's happened, Supervisor Frederick, is that because heroin is the drug of choice now, 10 years ago, everybody that we busted were cocaine dealers. Now it's hard to find cocaine dealers. Everybody is in the heroin business.
Okay, heroin. Okay, that's it. Okay, but there's a lot of dealers out there, obviously, because the price is driven down by the.
And what's happened is, all of us think about heroin as coming from Southeast Asia. Now heroin is produced in Mexico, brought up by the same methods that cocaine was brought up. So it's cheaper to produce, cheaper to transport. All of those things have occurred.
Thank you.
Supervisor Decker, you have the floor.
You mentioned in your presentation that a lot of this starts with the prescription medicine and how doctors changed the way they were prescribing opiates. Have they realized the error of their ways, and are they reverting back, or has that not happened yet? Has it not come full circle yet?
So,
because people are just going to continue into this addiction if we don't cut it off where the doctors are prescribing it, and these pain treatment centers and things like that.
Right. So what has happened as part of this? You know that the culture changed because we have all these pain management clinics, right? All those places are really are to prescribe opioids, right? I was watching an ad the other day where it was advertising a drug to deal with the constipation you had from the fact that you were taking opioids. So you were supposed to take yet another drug to deal with the fact that you had this consequence of opioids. I mean, what are we coming to? So, Supervisor Decker, there is some change, and I think that's why there's a 12% rollback. I think that doctors are beginning to change, but the system is still geared towards rewarding for some rough rewards, right? There's a profit. If a doctor prescribes medication, of course, the way our current medical system is, if you're required to see that doctor, he charges by the visit. So there's some profit that we still have to combat in the current system. But also, if you think about all doctors are parts of HMOs now, right? And part of an HMO assesses by the surveys patients do on a doctor. So if I'm a person who wants to be pain-free, and I want the most powerful drugs that make me pain-free, and my doctor warns me, well, no, that's going to be difficult for you because you might get some dependency or so forth. How am I going to evaluate that doctor for my HMO? And so there's a consequence to doctors. So we're dealing with that, but certainly I think the tide is beginning to change.
That's good to hear. And I did read an article where you're speaking about how doctors are kind of judged based on if their patients leave pain-free, and that if that's what they're being judged on, of course they're going to prescribe drugs to make them pain-free. If that's what gives them the A rating, they're not going to want to let someone walk out the door in pain and possibly give them a C rating. Then this kind of follows up on what Supervisor Bostrom said, those people in the middle. I know that Vivitrol's pilot program I don't know if you would call it experimental, but can a person get Vivitrol in a private treatment center using their own health insurance?
Yeah,
You know, your average person on the street who is, you know, your neighbor that's addicted to opiates because of prescribing, can they go in, or is this something where they're going to fall through the cracks until they get busted? And
So I can't speak to whether private insurance covers it in all circumstances. I can tell you that there are doctors who are, you know, you have to get a certain certification or a certain approval to be a person who prescribes Vivitrol, but there are doctors who you can go to privately to do that. So, you know, for anybody who's listening to this, for anybody who has a crisis within their own family or those they know, this is something to explore privately, you know, if that is an issue. So yeah, this is available for folks. It's not routinely, you know, it's not every doctor who can prescribe this, but it is available, and we've talked a little bit about that as we put this program together.
are there doctors in Kenosha County, do you know of, or off the top of your head you don't know?
If not in Kenosha County, they are close enough and have some time in Kenosha County. So they're folks who are available to Kenosha County.
Okay, thank you.
Supervisor Retzloff, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think, Mike, that's the second time I've heard your presentation. Thank you very much. I've got a couple comments just on this a little bit. I remember shows all the way in the early 80s, I sat through something like this where the world was coming to an end because of HIV and AIDS. And I was sitting with medical professionals. It was unbelievable. Right. And the point I'm making with that is it's not what it is now. I mean, things, because people got involved, it had it became a community problem. Yep. It had people like Magic Johnson and all that. Yep. And you think about breast cancer. It's in the NFL. The players wear the ribbons, and it has community involvement. And you think of Alzheimer's, same thing. In fact, I saw a sign, there's a 5-mile walk on this. Point I'm making is people have a tendency to support things that they know aren't necessarily that person's fault. When it comes to drug addiction, alcohol addiction, someone in their lives made a choice that they're going to do that, where you didn't make a choice that you're going to have breast cancer and so forth. The point I'm making is it coming from law enforcement is kind of unique here. This should maybe come more from the community side. I appreciate everything you've said, but where is the support of the people that do these things? Where's the walk for this? Where's the ribbons? Where's the input from some famous celebrities that maybe have had these problems? How do we communicate that in a community situation? It's just my opinion on this matter, and I'd be curious to know what you think.
And I think that's why the folks who are here to really be sure that you guys know that there's a lot of community support for these efforts. So I want to recognize the audience as people who really wanted to be sure that, you know, that message was heard. But, you know, part of what you're talking about is the stigma about heroin based on prior stereotypes about who abuses heroin that I think doesn't allow an honest and real conversation. You know, when Guida and I have gone around to these service clubs, right, we'll go around, and at the point we start talking about the problem, no one personalizes the issue. No one in a group setting ever tells us, oh, this has affected my family or my loved one or my child. And then you know what happens as soon as the room is over? People will flock to us. One by one, people will privately, secretly whisper to us, this has happened to me, this is in my family. And I think to myself, what a different conversation we would have had people been willing to have that conversation in a public place. And, you know, I think that's the value of what Magic Johnson did, right? He allowed us to have public conversations. There were a whole group of people who were assigning personal blame to people with HIV based on conduct, right? But Magic Johnson and people like that got us to be able to have an honest conversation where people could change those kind of impressions. That must happen in this situation. And that's why it's so important to me that you hear the current generation of heroin addicts are oftentimes people like everyone else, started with prescribed painkillers, made no conscious choice to abuse drugs, before they were in the throes of this addiction before they ever made a single conscious choice. And they thought to themselves, this is a doctor's prescription. You know, they managed to convince themselves that all was well, and here they are.
Anything else, Supervisor Retzloff? Thank you. Vice Chair Esposito.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mike, great job. My concern on this issue is to piggyback on what Supervisor Decker said. I want to make sure that we're discussing this with these young children on this opioid addictive process. You just brought it up again. This is where this is starting.
Yep.
And I think that we're going to get the most traction on this issue starting in the beginning instead of starting it as what Supervisor Kent said. So I would like to see that, you know, if we do some of these things, and I think it's mandatory to do this in the school arena type situation, and really let these kids know what you're potentially going down, what road you're going down. You just made a comment, and it's the comment that it's been through the whole presentation that I'm catching, that you don't make this decision potentially to become a heroin addict. It starts somewhere. So if they don't start, maybe, you know, I mean, all these other pilot programs are great, but I really think if you get it in the infantile stage is what we're looking to do. I mean, I'd like to bring that up because I think that I don't want that to get missed. Because if that gets missed, then we're talking about the same thing again here every year over and over and over and over again. So I just wanted to bring that up. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm hearing that sentiment from the board loud and clear. Yeah.
Any other questions? Supervisor Gens.
Yeah, I'll be brief. I don't want to go home tonight and look in the mirror and not have said something personal. So, I mean, you hit me with that one. So, not that I'm taking anything right now, but my 20-year-old daughter had commented that there was two people she knew that had passed from heroin overdose. So, you know, I mean, if you're thinking this is, you know, rich, poor, educated, just like Supervisor Bostrom said, you're missing the boat. That's right. You're missing the boat. So, I mean, for her to say that to me, you know, I'm like, whoa, you know, something's, and that's why I brought up the kids stuff. Now, we've got to, you know, we're sitting here looking at a big overview, doctors, kids, the middle, what programs are we doing? I would like to see the Chair of Human Services put this on an agenda and see what we can do. I don't know if we need law enforcement, you know, officials going into the schools. I agree, but there's got to be some way that we can further this at the foundation of when this stuff occurs. And hey, I'm all for treating it later too, but you know what? If you could stop stuff in the beginning, you're way ahead of the game. So I just think that's an important thing to do. Thank you.
We'd be happy to be a part of that. Happy.
Any other questions? Okay. Mike, I want to thank you so much for coming in and giving your presentation tonight.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, we'll go ahead and take a break until 7:30 when we can start our regular meeting. Oh. Gable, in a second.